Imagine the scene Hollywood sold you. A lone cowboy sits beneath a blanket of stars, a thick steak sizzling over an open flame, the smell of seared beef drifting into the desert night. He eats alone, content, silhouetted against the fire like a painting. It's a beautiful image. It's also almost entirely a lie. The real cowboy at the end of a 16-hour day in the saddle wasn't eating steak. He was eating beans that had been soaking since sunrise, a biscuit fried in rendered fat, and whatever the cook decided to scrape together from a wooden box bolted to the back of a wagon. And if he complained about it, he might not eat it all the next day, because the man running that wagon held more power over his life than the trail boss did. To understand what cowboys actually ate, you first have to understand what the frontier actually was. It was not a grocery store. It was not a ranch with a garden out back. It was hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles of open, empty land, crossed on horseback, with no refrigeration, no reliable water source, and no room on a pack animal for anything that wasn't absolutely essential. Every single item of food that made it onto that trail had to survive weeks of jostling in a wagon, baking under the sun, and getting soaked in river crossings. That single constraint, survival, shaped almost everything a cowboy put in his mouth. Fresh meat, the kind Hollywood loves to show sizzling over a fire, was actually one of the rarest things a cowboy ate, not because there weren't cattle around. There were thousands of them. But a cow was capital. It was the entire point of the drive. You did not slaughter your inventory to make dinner. Fresh beef only appeared on the trail when an animal was injured, sick, or had broken a leg in a prairie dog hole and had to be put down anyway. When that happened, the crew ate well for exactly as long as that meat lasted before it spoiled, which in the summer heat of Texas or Kansas might be a day or two at most. After that, it was back to what the wagon carried, and what the wagon carried changed everything. In 1866, a Texas rancher named Charles Goodnight took an old military surplus wagon and rebuilt it into something that would define frontier cooking for the next 50 years. He reinforced the frame with iron axles strong enough to survive brutal terrain, and at the back he built a hinged box, essentially a cabinet, that folded down into a work table when the wagon stopped for the night. Inside that box were drawers and shelves holding everything the cook needed. Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, dried beans, lard, and the spices that made monotonous food bearable. Underneath the wagon bed hung a cowhide sling called the possum belly, which carried firewood and dried buffalo chips for fuel, since a treeless prairie doesn't exactly offer a lot of kindling. This was the chuck wagon, and it was not just a kitchen. It was a mobile pharmacy stocked with whiskey, quinine, and bandages. It was a bank, holding the crew's mail and sometimes their wages. And most importantly, it was the emotional center of camp. After a day of dust, heat, and the very real danger of a stampede, the chuck wagon was the one predictable, comforting thing on the entire drive, which brings us to the single most powerful man on any cattle drive who wasn't the trail boss. The cook. Trail hands called him the coosie, a rough American twist on the Spanish word cocinero. And coosie ran that wagon like a king running a small, extremely hungry kingdom. He was often the highest paid man on the crew, sometimes earning more than the cowboys who actually herded the cattle, because a bad cook could break morale faster than bad weather, and a good one could hold a crew together through genuine hardship. Coosie's day started hours before anyone else's. While the rest of the outfit was still asleep, he was already awake in pitch darkness, coaxing a fire to life, grinding coffee, and mixing dough by feel because there was no light to see by. Cowboys woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Coosie's voice, and woe to the man who wandered too close to that wagon before food was ready. The area immediately around the chuck wagon was sacred ground. Cowboys learned fast never to ride up on it from the wrong direction, never to tie a horse near it, and never, ever to help themselves to the supplies without asking. Coosie guarded his flour and his sugar the way a dragon guards gold, because he knew exactly how many miles stood between his wagon and the next town where he could restock. Run out of flour on day 10 of a 6-week drive and you don't just have hungry cowboys, you have a mutiny. So what was actually in that wagon, and what did it become on a tin plate? The single most important food on the entire frontier, more important than beef, was beans. Pinto beans specifically, dried, and cooked low and slow for hours in a heavy pot suspended over coals. Coosie would often start them soaking before dawn so they'd be tender by supper time. Beans were cheap, they traveled well because they were dried, they were packed with protein, and they could be stretched to feed a hungry crew without needing constant resupply. Alongside the beans came biscuits, and this is where a lot of the real skill of trail cooking showed up. Coosie carried a sourdough starter, a living culture of fermented flour and water, sometimes kept alive for years, passed from cook to cook like a family heirloom. That starter meant biscuits could rise without needing store-bought yeast, which was a luxury nobody was hauling across the plains. The biscuits were baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven, buried in hot coals, the coals piled on the lid as well as underneath so the bread cooked evenly from all sides. Get that wrong and you'd either burn the bottom or leave the middle raw, and Coosie's reputation lived and died by his biscuits. Meat, when it wasn't fresh beef, meant salt pork, sometimes called sowbelly, cured and preserved in heavy salt to survive weeks without spoiling. It was fried up in a skillet, and here's the part that would surprise most people. The grease left over from frying that salt pork was not thrown away. It was treasured. That fat became the base for gravy, it flavored the beans, it greased the Dutch oven for baking, and it was often poured directly over biscuits as a kind of makeshift sauce. Nothing, and this cannot be overstated, nothing was wasted on the frontier. When cattle actually were slaughtered on the trail, usually because of injury, the crew practiced what we'd now call nose-to-tail eating, though nobody used that phrase back then, they just called it not starving. Organ meats, the liver, the heart, the tongue, were often considered delicacies and eaten first, before they had a chance to spoil, since they didn't preserve as well as muscle cuts. There's a legendary trail dish, and its real name is a bit too colorful for polite company, so most folks call it son of a gun stew, made from the heart, liver, brains, sweetbreads, and marrow of a freshly butchered calf, all simmered together into a thick, rich stew that used every usable part of the animal before any of it went bad. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't Instagram famous. But it fed a working crew and it wasted nothing. Coffee deserves its own moment here, because on the trail, coffee wasn't a beverage, it was practically a food group and a religion combined. It was boiled strong, often described as thick enough to float a horseshoe, and cowboys drank it constantly, partly for the caffeine to get through impossibly early mornings, and partly because boiled water was simply safer to drink than whatever questionable creek the herd had just churned into mud. Coosie roasted and ground the beans himself, right there at camp, and a cowboy showing up late to the fire after the coffee ran out was in for a genuinely miserable day. Sugar was a treat, hoarded and used sparingly, mostly to sweeten that coffee or occasionally to make a simple dessert if supplies allowed and the mood was right. And speaking of rare treats, dried fruit, apples, peaches, sometimes raisins, made the trip in small quantities and were considered close to a luxury item. When Coosie had enough on hand, he'd make what trail hands called son of a gun in a sack, a boiled fruit and suet pudding wrapped in cloth, which for men living on beans and salt pork day after day, tasted like an absolute miracle. What almost never appeared, and this really does shatter the campfire steak fantasy, were fresh vegetables. There was simply no way to keep produce from spoiling across weeks on the open trail. This wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a genuine health problem. Cowboys on long drives sometimes developed symptoms of scurvy from the near total absence of fresh produce and vitamin C in their diet. When canned tomatoes did show up in a supply wagon, and they occasionally did once canning technology became more available later in the century, they were treated less like a vegetable and more like a small miracle. Cowboys would eat them straight out of the can, and some accounts describe men actually drinking the tomato juice afterward, both for the taste and, whether they fully understood it or not, because their bodies were desperately craving something the rest of their diet simply couldn't provide. So the next time you picture a cowboy under those Hollywood stars, cutting into a perfectly seared steak, replace that image with the truth. Picture a man hunched over a tin plate of beans and salt pork gravy, a biscuit in one hand, a cup of coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in beside him, grateful that Coosie decided to share the last of the dried apples that night. Picture a cook who was awake before the sun, guarding his flour like it was gold, running a kitchen out of a wooden box bolted to a wagon, keeping an entire crew fed, healthy enough to work, and just comfortable enough to keep riding another 16 hours the next day. That, not the steak dinner under the stars, was the real taste of the American frontier. It wasn't glamorous. It was resourceful, it was disciplined, and in its own quiet way, it was one of the most impressive survival systems the American West ever produced.